It was a cold, pale morning near Remagen in 1945. Frost lay on the grass like dust, and the sound of boots crunching gravel rang across the muddy field. 50 captured German women stood in a row, their faces white, jaws stiff, clothes ripped and worn. Across from them, American medics moved carefully, holding clipboards, their breath visible in the chilly air. What was about to happen wasn't torture or questioning. It was worse in its own way. It was taking away their pride with rules. No one spoke at first. The air felt heavy with shame and shock. One young German woman, barely 20, whispered, "They'll treat us like animals." Another said sharply, "Hold your head high. Don't let them see you weak." But the Americans weren't mocking or laughing. Their faces were blank, calm, and uncaring. That was the surprise. Not hate, not revenge, just cold routine. A sergeant yelled, "Medical check line. Step forward." His voice wasn't mean, just firm. One by one, the women moved up, opening their coats in the faint morning light. Each step felt heavy. A German nurse froze. A soldier at the front flinched when an American officer's gloved hand stopped her. He wasn't staring. He was writing, measuring, noting cuts, hunger, and lice. She felt sick realizing she was just a number, not a person. Records say by the war's end, over 3,500 German women were captured in the West. Most were nurses, clerks, or helpers, not fighters, yet they faced the same cold process as any prisoner. The check was to stop disease, but to the women, it felt like their dignity was being taken away, piece by piece, under American eyes. One woman later wrote in her diary, "They looked at us like machines. No hate, no want, just steps." That thought stayed with her for years. It wasn't American cruelty. It was something colder, a machine-like fairness. As the last woman stepped up, an officer lifted his clipboard, tapping his pen on the metal edge. The sound cut through the icy air like a knife. He fixed his glasses, face blank, and what he saw next set the tone for the whole check. The clipboard hit his chest with a soft thud. His face stayed stiff, distant. "Start part 2, he said quietly to the nurse beside him. Pencil scratched on paper. The check had begun. Steam came from the women's mouths as they breathed through tight teeth. Boots shuffled on gravel. Somewhere nearby, a generator buzzed, and the smell of fuel mixed with soap. The first woman stepped up. The officer didn't look at her eyes. His gloved hand pointed to the medic. "Check for lice. Note cuts. Hunger level 3. His voice was like reading a shopping list. The nurse's hands shook a little as she wrote it all down. The woman's ribs showed through her skin, her collarbone sharp like wire. She looked starved, like many in the war's final months. Sunken cheeks, empty eyes. U.S. military logs say nearly 40% of German women prisoners in 1945 had clear signs of sickness or hunger. Many hadn't seen good food or soap in weeks, but numbers couldn't show the tension in that tent. The war became a list of scars, sores, and infections. Each check was a small shame measured in seconds. A German prisoner whispered, "At least the Soviets would have shot us." Another muttered, "No, this is slower." Yet when the officer saw her shaking hands, he didn't yell or punish. He paused. His eyes flicked to her name tag, then back to the chart. "She's fine," he said softly. "Move her on." That calm cut deeper than cruelty. To the women, it felt like being erased. The Americans weren't looking for beauty, guilt, or innocence, just sickness. Every touch was careful, every move planned. It wasn't desire or hate. It was paperwork with a pulse. Later, one prisoner wrote, "It wasn't cruelty. It was shame by not caring." That idea echoed in the barracks for months. As the officer moved down the line, his clipboard smudged with pencil marks and fingerprints, his assistant paused. A hint of worry crossed her face. She was young, about 21, a U.S. Army nurse who'd seen too much too fast. And in that moment, she made a choice that broke the check's rhythm completely. The tense canvas flapped in the wind, snapping over the tension. The check line stopped. The young American nurse, hair tucked under a loose cap, eyes tired, stood still. The next German woman waited in front of her, half-dressed, shaking not from cold but from being exposed. The officer looked up, annoyance flashing behind his glasses. "Continue, Lieutenant," he said sharply. But she didn't move. Her gloved hands shook. She'd followed orders from Normandy to the Rhineland, bandaging wounds, cutting off limbs, cleaning sores that smelled of death. But now, staring at this thin German girl, barely older than her, the nurse's breath caught. "Sir, this isn't right," she whispered. The officer's jaw tightened. "We have to check for lice and disease. Rules are rules." His pencil scratched again, trying to bury feelings with routine. But the nurse's voice broke the flow. The line of prisoners stiffened, watching this small stand in silence. The Geneva Convention of 1929 said female prisoners should be checked only by women with respect kept. But in the field, those rules often blurred. Reports later showed many American medics, swamped by thousands of prisoners, followed bare-bones steps, literally and not. The nurse's refusal started whispers among the Germans. One said softly, she looked away, "That's the first kindness we've seen." It wasn't pity that moved them. It was knowing someone, even an enemy, felt their shame. The officer sighed. "Fine. Move on. Eyes only." He rubbed his forehead, tiredness heavier than his rank. The check went on, but slower, quieter. The pencil marks no longer sounded automatic. They paused between lines. Later, one German helper's diary read, "She looked away. That's when I knew this wasn't revenge." For the first time since capture, the women saw an American hesitate, not from danger, but from heart. Outside, rain tapped the tent roof, washing away muddy footprints. Inside, the silence grew thicker. The nurse stepped back, arms crossed, refusing to look up again. The officer's face hardened. He knew he couldn't let that pause spread through his team. So the argument started. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding the tent like far-off cannons. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and authority. The check line froze again, half-dressed prisoners waiting, guards glancing uneasily. The officer slammed his clipboard on a table. "Lieutenant, we can't afford feelings," he snapped. "These checks stop typhus in the camps." The nurse stood firm, rain dripping from her cap. "With respect, sir, this isn't a check anymore. It's a shame. They're scared." A medic nearby looked up from his notes. "She's not wrong," he muttered. The officer's glare cut through him, but the silence had shifted. For the first time, the men hesitated, not from disobedience, but from doubt. Red Cross records say in spring 1945, American medical teams processed up to 200 prisoners an hour during big surrenders. Speed mattered more than feelings. Yet here, in one German tent, that pace finally broke. The officer paced, boots grinding in mud. "You think they didn't shame our nurses in France? You think they'd pause?" His words hit hard but felt empty. The nurse looked at the silent German women, wet, staring ahead. "Maybe that's why we should," she whispered. The tent went quiet. For a moment, only rain filled the air. A young private coughed. The officer breathed out, shoulders dropping. "Fine," he said, voice tired. "Minimal touch. Eyes only. Note what you see. Move the line." The Germans didn't smile or thank her, but the air changed, a strange calm mixed with shock. One woman wrote later, "They argued for us." That thought shook her more than any touch could. The new orders spread fast. Eyes only, no extra touching. It made the process slower but kinder if kindness fit in war. As the tent lights flickered, the nurse stepped back, breathing hard. She knew she'd won something small but real. The officer picked up his clipboard, his hand shaking slightly as he turned a page. "Resume," he said softly. "Let's finish this." Outside, a guard shouted, "New rules. Next phase begins." The rain eased by morning, leaving the camp muddy and quiet. The new rules had spread. Eyes only, no touching unless needed. It sounded kind on paper, but it sharpened the shame. The women stood under bright lights, stripped to thin shirts, every mark and scar lit up. The Americans stayed back now, eyes scanning, pens writing, faces blank. The line moved faster. One officer timed it with a watch, calling, "Next, next, next." The pace felt like a factory, but the repeated looks felt colder than touch ever did. The prisoners weren't touched, but being seen cut deeper. A German nurse whispered to the woman beside her, "They don't see us, just bodies to mark off." The irony hit her. She'd done the same to wounded soldiers back home, never looking twice. Now she was the one under cold mercy. Medical reports after the change showed infection cases dropped by 18%. It worked by numbers, but it hollowed them out as people. The American officers noted fevers, cuts, and rashes from afar. Clipboards replaced hands. Kindness became paperwork. The young nurse who'd refused the close checks stood aside, eyes down, quiet. Her small win had turned to quiet guilt. Her choice made things cleaner, not kinder. One German prisoner later said, "They touched us less, but their looks burned deeper." That cold, judging gaze made every woman feel cut open without a knife. Behind the line, a guard whispered to another, "Ever wonder if they think we're monsters?" The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Orders are orders." That phrase echoed the same hard logic the Germans once used. The balance was uneasy, almost poetic. By noon, the last woman passed the check. The officers signed off, lights dimmed, and the rain's soft sound returned. But inside each prisoner, something raw had shifted. They weren't just prisoners now, they saw how mercy could still shame. As they walked back to the barracks, no one spoke. The sound of rain on tin roofs followed them into the night. Night fell heavy and empty. The women shuffled into their barracks, tin roofs shaking in the wind, a single bulb flickering by the door. The air smelled of soap, wet wool, and fear. No one spoke at first. The check was over, but its shadow stayed. They washed in silence, buckets clanging, water turning gray with dirt and shame. A German helper, once proud in her Luftwaffe uniform, stared at her reflection in a steel basin. Her hands shook as she scrubbed, the cold biting her knuckles. "They saw everything," she whispered to the walls. Across from her, another said, "At least they didn't hit us." It was meant to comfort but sounded like giving up. The barracks were plain, wooden bunks, army blankets, soap bars marked U.S. Army. Outside, guards walked quietly, their boots steady and far. Inside, the prisoners' whispers turned from shame to shock. They couldn't make sense of it. The Americans checked them, shamed them, but then gave them food, real food, soft bread, canned beans, even coffee. U.S. Camp logs say each prisoner got about 2,200 calories a day, better than most German civilians in 1945. Some camps gave vitamins and soap from extra Red Cross stock. The contrast hit hard. The hands that took their pride now fed them better than their own army ever did. One woman wrote in her notebook, "They fed us better than our own commanders." It wasn't thanks, it was confusion. Her beliefs cracked under that truth. The younger women tried to sleep. The older ones prayed quietly, not for freedom, but for answers. Every creak of the bunks sounded like the boots from the tent. As the bulb flickered out, one woman whispered in the dark, "Do they hate us or feel sorry for us?" No one answered. The question hung in the stale air like a secret. In the corner, the nurse, now prisoner 114B, closed her eyes. She wasn't angry anymore. She was curious about why the enemy's kindness hurt more than cruelty. That curiosity grew by morning. By dawn, the silence broke. Steam from soup kettles mixed with chatter that wasn't there the night before. The German women, nurses, typists, helpers, started asking small questions. What's in this bread? Why's their coffee so strong? How do they get soap that smells like fruit? It wasn't rebellion, it was shock turning to wonder. Outside, an American guard leaned on a fence, cigarette in his lips. A prisoner approached, nervous but brave. "Do you trade?" she asked, pointing to the cigarette. He grinned, held up 2 fingers. 2 for 1. She gave him 2 handmade hairpins. He handed her an aspirin packet. She stared at the tiny tablets like they were treasure. This was how it started, quiet trades that showed something more dangerous than rebellion: understanding. Red Cross records say by late 1945, the U.S. Army gave out over 9 million hygiene kits to prisoner camps across Europe, with soap, toothpaste, combs, and sometimes chocolate. For women who'd washed with cold water and sand for months, it was like a piece of normal life. But that plenty didn't comfort them, it insulted them. One prisoner muttered, "They fight a war and still have time for perfume." Another whispered, "Their uniforms don't even smell scared." For many, it was the first time they saw the war wasn't equal. The Americans had more weapons, food, medicine, supplies. Everything, even kindness, came from their plenty. A guard watched the women wash their faces with American soap, the lemon scent cutting the stale air. He said quietly to his friend, "They think we're angels." Wait till they see a factory. The other laughed. Yeah, they'll think we built heaven. That night, the prisoners talked about America like it was another world. Cars for all, milk in bottles, soldiers who didn't starve. One wrote, "Their plenty was an insult." But that insult soon turned to awe when they saw where it came from. Outside the camp, trucks were arriving, endless, rumbling, loaded with supplies that changed what power meant. The ground shook before the sound hit. A deep roar, not from guns but from engines. Dozens of U.S. supply trucks rolled through the mud, lined up like an iron river. The German women, holding their soup tins, drifted to the fence. The noise filled the morning. Diesel fumes stung the air. The first truck passed, a GMC CCKW, white star on its side, canvas flapping. Then another and another carrying crates of food, fuel, medicine, uniforms, even cigarettes. The convoy seemed endless. Some women counted to 50 before stopping. One muttered, "That's more than our whole division ever had." They weren't looking at soldiers anymore. They saw machines of plenty. Allied records say one American infantry division used about 6,000 gallons of fuel a day, more than a whole German corps. Each truck carried tons of goods to keep an army moving for weeks. Where Germany scraped for soap, the U.S. shipped it by the ton. Where Germans begged for boots, Americans burned old ones to make room for new. A prisoner whispered, "No wonder we lost. They had more trucks than we had tanks." Her words were half awe, half despair. From the guard tower, an American sergeant watched them. "You can see it in their eyes," he said to a private. "They're realizing it wasn't about bravery. It was about factories." The convoy kept coming, kitchens, water tanks, medical vans. The women couldn't look away. Some laughed nervously, others cried quietly. A clerk from Hamburg pressed her hands to the fence and whispered, "We weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting production lines." That sight broke something deeper than pride. It shattered the idea of a fair fight. The German women had been taught sacrifice could win wars. Now they saw plenty could end them. The engines faded, leaving exhaust and silence. The camp felt smaller, the fences more real. Inside the barracks, one woman stared at her rations and said softly, "We could never have one." That night, the camp was quiet, but not from fear. It was the silence of truth sinking in. The women sat on their bunks, staring into tin cups of black coffee, thinking not of freedom but of why they'd believed what they did. The trucks had shown what bullets couldn't. The truth. A former propaganda clerk whispered, "Everything we learned was a lie." The others didn't answer, but their eyes showed enough. She'd once typed speeches about German greatness, about purity and fate. Now she wore a patched American blanket, ate Allied bread, and lived because of enemy medicine. A U.S. medic walked by, handing out vitamin pills. One prisoner looked up and said, "Thanks." He nodded, "Keep moving." That small moment, simple and human, cut through years of beliefs like sunlight through fog. U.S. Army surveys after the war said over 70% of German prisoners changed their political views in captivity. The numbers weren't propaganda, they showed shock, proof that human connection could break indoctrination faster than questioning. A woman from Dresden said quietly, "When I saw their trucks, I knew our war was a dream. They lived in the future and we were dying in the past." Her friend replied, "The Führer said we were chosen, but they had trucks that never stopped. Maybe they were chosen." The words weren't betrayal anymore, they were grief. In her bunk, a nurse pulled out a torn notebook she'd hidden since Normandy. She wrote, "The lies we believed taste like ashes now." She closed it and hid it under her pillow. Outside, floodlights buzzed, lighting rows of barbed wire that no longer felt like punishment, just reality. The camp wasn't hell. It was proof. From the guard post, the young American nurse watched them quietly. She saw their eyes, no longer defiant but empty, searching. She wondered what it felt like to lose not just a war but a whole worldview. Then, as she turned to leave, she saw something unexpected, a small act that changed everything again. Morning mist hung low, curling around the fences like ghostly smoke. The German women lined up for rations, same tin trays, same silence. But at the end of the line, something new happened. A young American guard, barely 20, noticed a woman lagging behind. Her uniform hung loose, her skin gray with sickness. She coughed weakly, holding her side. He looked around, no officers nearby. From his pocket, he pulled a small bar of soap from a Red Cross crate marked Med. Without a word, he placed it on her tray next to the bread. She froze, staring at the white bar like it was gold. He nodded once and moved on. That was it. No speech, no pity, just soap and silence. Later, that woman wrote, he said nothing, but it meant everything. To the prisoners, it wasn't the soap, it was what it stood for. Kindness without demand, mercy without politics. For months, they'd been handled, measured, checked, processed. Now, for one brief moment, they were seen. Reports say after hygiene changes in late 1945, disease in U.S. run prisoner camps dropped by 30%. But numbers couldn't show the mental shift. The women began washing again, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to feel human. The smell of soap became the smell of healing. That night, the woman who got the soap split it into 3 pieces and shared it with her bunkmates. They washed their hands, laughing softly at the strange luxury of being clean. The barracks filled with a faint citrus scent, the first real laughter in weeks. Outside, the guard smoked his last cigarette, watching the barracks window glow under the moon. He didn't know what his small act started, but by morning, the camp felt lighter. Discipline returned, not from orders but from rebuilding dignity, one bar of soap at a time. The sound of brooms sweeping became the morning song. The women who once shook under floodlights now scrubbed floors, sorted supplies, and hummed softly. The barracks, once heavy with shame, began to echo with something new: order, not from sergeants but from people rebuilding themselves. Every morning at dawn, the prisoners lined up for roll call, then cleaned, washed clothes, and did small tasks set by American officers. It wasn't forced work, it was structure. The structure that once broke them now held them up. A former secretary from Munich taught English using torn newspaper bits. A nurse helped the camp medic clean the infirmary. Within a week, the women built a fragile little society. The nurse wrote in her notebook, "We found discipline again, but not for war. U.S. Camp reports say nearly 40% of German prisoners volunteered for camp tasks once their health improved. In women's camps, routines cut anxiety and sickness sharply. It was mental healing disguised as work. The young American nurse, who'd once looked away during the check, now ran cleaning schedules. She watched the women move with quiet teamwork, and something in her softened. They weren't enemies anymore, just tired people learning to live again. One morning, she found a small group singing a hymn, voices rough but strong, rising over the sound of buckets and brooms. The song wasn't German. It came from an American radio days earlier. That borrowing was more than sharing, it was surviving by adapting. As sunlight slipped through cracks in the tin walls, the camp didn't look like punishment anymore. It looked like a place turning into life. That night, the nurse closed her logbook and whispered to a medic, "They're starting to heal." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe we all are." But healing brought new fears. Rumors of release, transport lists, and names being called spread. With hope came worry. It started as a whisper. A guard mentioned lists. A medic said transport by mistake. Soon, the camp buzzed with the word, release. Some women held their rosaries. Others packed their few things: a comb, a tin spoon, a folded blanket. Freedom was once a dream. Now it scared them. One woman asked, "Where will we go?" Her hometown, Königsberg, was gone. Another said, "My parents were in Dresden," and stopped. Going home wasn't a dream anymore. It was a wound reopening. The Americans saw the change. Smiles mixed with tears. Laughter turned to quiet sobs at night. The nurse walked through the barracks, counting heads. "You'll go home soon," she said softly. A voice from a bunk replied, "To what home?" U.S. Army records say over 425,000 German prisoners were sent home from American camps by 1946. Buses, ships, paperwork, health checks. But for many women, home was gone. War had burned maps and memories. In one corner, a woman polished her boots with a blanket corner, hands steady for the first time. "If they see us clean," she whispered, "maybe they'll forget what we were." Another helped braid her hair. Across the room, someone hummed the hymn, slower, more fragile. The nurse watched with mixed feelings, relief for fewer patients, but pain for knowing their stories, faces, and small jokes from ration lines. Now they'd vanish, one transport at a time. As night fell, engines rumbled beyond the fence. Trucks were ready. Guards spoke quietly, voices heavy. The women didn't sleep, clutching their small bags, staring at the ceiling. Freedom was coming, but was it rescue or exile? Dawn came slow, pale, and quiet. Trucks waited in neat rows outside the gate, canvas tops wet with dew, engines humming like a steady heartbeat. The women stepped out, each with a small bag, faces unreadable. Guards didn't yell anymore. They spoke softly, almost with respect. Names were checked off the clipboard that started it all. The young nurse stood by the gate, holding her cap against the wind. She watched the women climb into trucks, boots slipping in mud. For weeks, she'd seen them as patients, prisoners, survivors. Now they were travelers heading to a country she couldn't imagine feeling like home. Each truck held about 80 prisoners, with wooden benches and rattling metal rails. The air smelled of diesel and wet wool. Some women tried to smile, waving faintly at the guards. Others stared ahead, eyes empty but calm. Army records say each convoy carried about 400 prisoners per trip to northern ports like Bremen and Bremerhaven, where ships waited to take them to a broken Germany. The trip could take days or weeks. Inside one truck, a woman held her bag tightly, whispering a line she'd said since capture. We left clean, fed, and confused. The others nodded silently. As the convoy rolled out, dust rose behind the tires, blurring the camp. The women didn't look back. They didn't need to. Their memories were deep enough. The nurse raised her hand in a small salute, more respect than goodbye. One prisoner met her eyes through the truck's back flap and nodded faintly. Two strangers tied by a war neither wanted. The nurse lowered her hand, blinking against the morning light. The trucks rumbled down the dirt road, gray clouds swelling on the horizon. Inside, the women sat shoulder to shoulder. No songs, no speeches, just the low hum of engines and thoughts too heavy to say. Somewhere far off, church bells rang over ruins. Home was close, but peace felt impossibly far. Years later, in a quiet Hamburg cafe, one of those women sat with a reporter. The war was history, but its shadows stayed in her voice. She was 60, hair silver, posture straight. When asked what moment stayed with her, not a battle or surrender, but the check, she looked at her hands. They checked our bodies, she said softly, and it felt like the end of dignity. She paused, tracing her teacup's rim. But later, I saw it was the start of something else. The reporter leaned in. What do you mean? She smiled faintly. We thought they wanted to shame us, but they were just doing their job. And in that cold job, there was no hate. That's what shocked us most. They didn't care enough to hate. Her words lingered like smoke. Records show only about 3% of female prisoners filed complaints about U.S. treatment. Most spoke of shock, not from harm, but from moral confusion. They expected cruelty and found paperwork instead. That indifference was harder to handle than pain. The woman sipped her coffee, eyes far away. They took our pride, not our skin, she said. And looking back, that's what broke us. Not fists, not fire, just routine. Outside, traffic hummed, uncaring as ever. The city had rebuilt from rubble, glass towers over old stones. But for her, the memory of floodlights, clipboards, and quiet American medics never faded. I hated them for being gentle, she whispered, because it made me see who we'd become. The reporter stayed quiet. His recorder clicked off softly. She looked out the window, rain falling, steady and gray, like that morning in 1945. Maybe, she said almost to herself, humanity survives only when routine feels like mercy. As rain blurred the city lights, the reflection of a white tent seemed to flicker in the glass, distant, ghostly, forever caught between shame and survival.